On the show today, we'll focus on ways that innovators are applying blockchain technology in the global financial markets. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag #BeyondMarkets, and you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther Ugudaga. Now, blockchain is revolutionizing financial markets around the world. Binkabi, a blockchain-based commodity trading platform, has launched a pilot program for agriculture commodity traders in emerging markets. Quan, CEO of Binkabi, joins me to shed some light on how blockchain can be applied to commodity trading. Binkabi, thank you so much for... Quan, thank you so much for taking the time out to join us today. Now, it's quite interesting
it's good to be
how
here.
Blockchain is revolutionizing so many things. I mean, the issue of ledgers, the issue of trust, transparency in the financial markets, and now we're seeing it being applied to commodities. It's working for gold, for the commodity gold already. So, but I want you to just give us some background in terms of how you expect blockchain to begin to revolutionize. I mean, when we talk about agriculture, for instance, how it's going to do that.
Sure. So, in agriculture supply chains, there are multiple issues in the agriculture supply chain. And we boil it down to three things. One is we call friction. Number two is funding and fairness. So those are the three Fs that we have in our system. Friction, when it comes to friction, is the number of intermediaries or middlemen in the supply chain. But also, for cross-border payment, we always have to go through US dollars. Last couple of years, Nigeria has not been very lucky with the oil price. And you see that suddenly in the system, there's not a lot of US dollars because crude oil price is low. So not only that Nigeria actually received less for its crude oil, but it's severely restraining the ability for Nigeria to be able to trade internationally because of the over-reliance on US dollars. So those are frictions. Funding is the ability for farmers, for commodity producers to be able to access funding at reasonable costs. In Nigeria, it's often at 20%, whereas in developed markets, normally less than 5%. In Nigeria, often people cannot access funding for farming. And finally, farming in these developing markets is one of those professions where high risk doesn't translate to high returns. So, farming is incredibly risky in terms of the nature, but farmers often receive very, very little for their production. So these are the three group of issues that are very prevalent within the agricultural supply chain.
But of course, now blockchain is set to change all of that. And Binkabi, you have a major announcement, a groundbreaking development, you call it. Tell us about that.
Sure. So we have partnered with TAC Group, TAC Agro, which is one of the major agro business in Nigeria. TAC, as many of you may know, is one of the major supplier of fertilizers for farmers in this country within the presidential fertilizer program. And TAC Group also have many assets along the supply chain. So the idea is that TAC and Binkabi will come together to create the world's first blockchain-based commodity exchange based in Nigeria. And TAC will bring the physical assets, whereas Binkabi will bring the technology and the know-how for the exchange.
So when you say commodities, is it agriculture commodities?
Correct.
Okay.
So agriculture commodities, things like paddy rice, like maize,
grains,
sorghum, and so on.
So how exactly is it going to work? Tell us about, break it down for us.
Sure. So in order to be able to trade on the exchange, first of all, the commodities need to be, we call, tokenized. The way we do that is the farmers or the depositor of the commodities will bring the commodity into the warehouse. The warehouse then issued a warehouse receipt. Okay. We tokenize the warehouse receipt and have them to be traded on our exchange. Once the buyers have the warehouse receipt, they can go to the warehouse to get the commodities out for them to be able to process further or to export to their countries.
So when is this going to start? How soon is
so
this
we are launching, subject to some legal clearance, we are launching the pilot program involving real users, real money, and real commodities. So initially we targeting blockchain crypto enthusiasts, and this is a way for it's a new opportunity for crypto enthusiasts to get exposure to commodities, which is essential for our lives. Commodities are things that feed us, build our buildings, and run the transport system. So really is essential stuff of life that for the first time crypto investor can get access to. So when they are doing that, then they also help the farmers,
now,
the 500 million farmers.
Now this is all being powered by technology. What is the feedback that you've gotten so far in terms of awareness and acceptance of this technology, blockchain, the process that you're going to use?
Sure. So awareness is a process that is growing. Across the world, there's very, very small percentage of people actually have a blockchain wallet. So in terms of the awareness, it's still some way to go. But over the last couple of years, the level of awareness has increased significantly. The adoption of the technology very much depends on how user-friendly that is, or the user experience. And right now, blockchain technology is not quite there in terms of user experience yet. So that is still under development for the entire blockchain industry as a whole.
What about reception here in Nigeria and how it's been received? What are the feelers or feedback that you've gotten here? I mean, you're going to set one up here, so what is the feedback you've gotten?
So we just had a meetup yesterday in Lagos, here in Lagos, and there was up to 100 people turn up at the event. A lot of them are young people graduated from agriculture universities. Some of them are commodity brokers. So the reception has been very, very good. A lot of people came up to me, took selfie after the meetup. So we took it as they really like to be involved in what we call emerging trader program for the pilot. Because with blockchain technology, you can actually lower the barrier to entry for people to be able to trade on the exchange. Okay. So normally in a traditional exchange, you have seats, you have straitjacket people on the trading floor. People have to buy seats for $100,000 to be able to trade on the exchange. People like ourselves cannot trade directly. We have to go to brokers. Here we are able to bring down the barrier to entry, so people like ourselves can trade as little as, let's say, $50 to $100. What it does is it provides liquidity for the exchange, which is crucial for the success of the exchange.
Now, I know that you're not exactly doing this alone. You're hoping, or you're looking to partner with a major agribusiness conglomerate here in Nigeria. Is that something you're willing to talk about?
Sure. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this chat, the company is TAC Group.
Okay, that is the TAC Group that you're talking about.
TAK Group, yeah, and we bring the physical and the technology together. Yeah.
Now, before now, many African countries, including Nigeria, have tried to set up commodity exchanges, and it just didn't work out. They all failed. What do you think is the problem? Why haven't African countries been able to set up a proper commodities exchange?
First of all, I would like to talk to why you need to set up the commodity exchange in the first place. So typically in farming, especially in sort of rain-fed kind of farming that are practiced in African countries, you have one season a year, which is at the end of the rainy season. So typically you have farmers borrowing at the beginning of cropping cycle and have to sell everything at harvest, because that's the only way that they can repay the loan. So without the ability to be able to store the commodities, because a lot of buyers, a lot of sellers at harvest and only a few buyers, the price are often depressed, unless it is a bad harvest, then you don't have much to sell. So the exchange actually solved the problem of actually having the crops into the warehouse, and then the crops, the warehouse receipt can then be traded, so it's open to a larger audience that can buy from. So the price can be higher, but also if farmers doesn't want to sell the commodity immediately, they can use that as a way to obtain financing from banks. So that's why exchanges are very, very important, both in terms of realizing more value for farmers, but also other kind of instruments like hedging commodity price risk. That's why exchange needs to be in place. However, if you, the African development banks actually did a study where they look at 28 exchange projects in Africa, and actually only 2 projects are working very well. One is Johannesburg exchange, and the other one is Ethiopia. But even in Ethiopia, it's not up to the potential yet. So the issues boils down to 2 things. One is liquidity, which I touch on. The ability that the exchange can attract a lot of buyers and sellers. And for this, we need to bring down the barrier to entry. We need to be able to allow the buyers can be able to buy for many exchanges. And the other thing is the cost of setup and run an exchange. Exchange can cost between $25 to $50 million or even more. But you always have a very low uptake at the beginning. So you have high cost and low uptake. So the exchange cannot last very long. And that's why these 2 reasons, the commodity liquidity and also the cost of setup and operate.
So blockchain just comes and just eliminates all of that, at least most of those entry barriers, and just, makes it a lot easier for participants to come into the market, and of course the much needed liquidity.
Sure.
Now you talked about, you're talking about the commodities themselves, and I know that you're going to have things like grains like maize, paddy rice, soybeans. What about, is there a chance that this list will be expanded in the future to maybe some things like tomatoes and some other crops that that are popular here in Nigeria? Sure. And I mentioned a crop like a tomato because for the issue of storage, that's a big problem here, and many farmers, for some other commodities also, they are unable to store for long because they don't have proper adequate storage facilities. Sure. And many of those crops or products perish as it were. So I'm thinking, how does the exchange, how would they help with that?
Yeah, sure. Tomato is actually a very interesting story alongside with orange. So when people harvest tomatoes, they go to the market, and if they cannot sell it, they will leave the tomatoes because there's no way that they can store it. So how it's being solved is for markets, for commodities that are very perishable, like tomatoes or cassava. Actually, Nigeria is the biggest cassava producer in the world, but cassava is, as soon as you harvest, you have 48 hours to process, otherwise it goes bad. So the way to do that is to develop futures contract.
Okay.
So you can forward sell the tomatoes or the cassava to the processing plant. So that at harvest, the processing plant can just send their trucks to
immediately on
to
the date agreed in
exactly.
the futures
exactly.
contract. Okay.
And that also helps the farmers in locking in the price. So they have certainty in terms of for their production.
But is this a feature that is going to be part? Should we expect to have this feature soon?
So as soon as we are able to demonstrate with the pilot with the physical, we call the physical commodities, then we'll get into forward.
Okay, Quan, hold that thought for us. We'll take a quick break. We appreciate your time. Thank you for your time so far. I've been speaking to Quan Lei, CEO of Binkabis. We're continuing our focus on how blockchain technology is changing the way commodities are traded around the world. Still with me in the studio is Quan Lei, the CEO of Binkabi. Quan, thank you for your time so far.
Thank you.
Now, you're quite familiar with Nigeria's agriculture space. Share your thoughts on how the value chain has progressed so far, or developed, as it were. So thinking about that and also reflecting on how this blockchain technology could help advance or develop the value chain from farm to table.
Sure, okay. So I think if talking about the entire sector is maybe it's easier to grasp if we focus on one commodity that this country is very much in need of, which is rice, which is also the thing that our another company, GrowMoX, has been helping African projects and Nigerian projects to grow rice in the last 7 years. So in the rice value chain, right now there's a ban on rice importation, but actually the ban has basically encourage other type of behaviors, for example, smuggling into the country. But if we look at the roots of the problem, here we have a agriculture system that the yield of the rice is not high enough. So even though the area cultivated can be large, but the yield is half or a third of the world's average, okay, then it will take a lot of areas to be able to grow. So yield is a major issue in agriculture production. Now, yield is basically a mother of all the reasons, because why farmers have low yield, because they don't have irrigation, they don't have access to mechanization, they don't have access to good seeds. But ultimately, what underpins all of this is they don't have access to finance, because banks and financial institutions are not ready to lend to the agriculture sector because they think the sector is too risky. And a lot of smallholder farmers, it's very difficult to serve and collect the loans from them. So access to finance is actually one of the largest barriers to agriculture production in this country, in the case of rice as example. So what blockchain technology does is it actually provides a good track or traceability of how the commodity is moving along the supply chain. In the case of warehouse receipt, which I mentioned, the ability to deposit the grains into the warehouse allows the bank to have collateral to provide finance. In the case of perishable commodities, we talk about tomatoes and cassava, the ability that there are off-taker for the commodities that will not only lock in the price for the farmers, but the banks are more comfortable to lend because they know the produce can be sold.
But you know, before now, and I think even now, physical commodity markets have been laggards when it comes to innovation, cutting-edge technology, just like blockchain, because I mean they're largely unregulated. I mean, always, as it were, avoiding the scrutiny of financial markets because many of them are in unregulated geographical areas. You know, when it comes to maybe mining, for instance, the truck leaves the factory, and there's this long process of the journey from either ship through a ship or train, a warehouse. So many things. There's so many moving parts, and so many things can change. Ownership can change while in that journey just to get to the destination. So I'm thinking that's one of the reasons why it's taken a while for commodity exchange. I mean, for commodity, physical commodities to be part of, or what is that word I'm looking for? To be part of, to be brought into the whole blockchain technology. So I'm thinking, how much of a difference is it going to make now? I mean, there's still the issue of the fact that they're still unregulated. So what's different now?
So it is unregulated, or you can call it, is one of the most decentralized industries in the world because there's multiple players along the supply chain. The reason why there's so many players and everyone, not everyone is adding value to that supply chain because of the lack of the issue of trust, the lack of trust. So, for example, if I was a SME and I export cashew nuts from Nigeria to Vietnam, for example, which is often the case, then I cannot directly export myself, but I have to go to a larger exporter. Most of the case, so because the importer and exporter across borders don't necessarily trust each other. So because of the lack of trust in the supply chain, that's why you have so many parties involved to provide this trust. But at the same time, they're adding more costs to the supply chain. And ultimately, what it means is the people at the beginning of the chain, the farmers, actually all the costs then pass ultimately to them because they are the worst bargaining power. So what blockchain actually provides is to provide this trust element to make sure that people can trust each other in their trading without actually having to go through the middleman or intermediaries. So because it is so complex and unregulated, as you said, that's why it takes time to sort through all the complexities.
And it's just amazing how blockchain has just come into, and it's taken a while. That's why I asked that question. I thought perhaps it's taken a while because maybe even blockchain itself couldn't solve that problem, but apparently it's been able to do that because as far as commodities are concerned, it started with gold and it's been successful with gold now. Now it's been applied to agricultural commodities. So looking at Nigeria or Africa, as it were, as a whole, if this is a pilot scheme for you, for Binkabi, right? So obviously you're hoping that it will catch on and take root. So what are your hopes and what is the big picture for you with this project? So, going from pilot stage, and what are you hoping, how are you hoping it to completely revolutionize the agriculture space, particularly here in Nigeria?
Sure. So, so after the successful pilot, then we will run another pilot, also in Nigeria, but also likely to be in another country. The idea is at the same time we will be preparing all the paperwork, all the plans to be able to apply for the exchange license. So by the time that the license is ready, we already have the product up and running and the exchange can operate immediately. Our vision is actually creating somewhat pan-African exchange platform. So what we mean by that is individual countries or individual region within the country can still have their own exchange. But what they do is they share the same technology layer and the same liquidity layer, because liquidity is so essential for exchanges to be successful. So the idea is a bit like Visa and MasterCard, where it doesn't matter which bank actually issues the card, but they are all plugged into the same technology platform. Okay. And when you have Visa, MasterCard, you can use that in Nigeria, but you can also use it in other countries. With every new users, new issuers come onto the network, it actually increases the value of the network. And that is what we are in our vision in terms of allowing countries to be able to, across Africa, to be able to set up exchange very inexpensively with a higher degree of level of success because they share the same technology platform and, more importantly, the liquidity platform.
What are those challenges that you envisage, or perhaps you experienced some already? I know that, I mean, for this platform, for blockchain, like you said, many of the entry barriers are limited, but I know that there's still challenges that you experience, that perhaps looking ahead that you feel that you are going to experience.
Sure. So you mentioned that only now that commodities is got some application for blockchain technology. There's a reason for that, because the moment you connect the real world to the blockchain, then how do you ensure that the blockchain, the token in the blockchain, actually reflect the commodities that's sitting in the warehouse? So that's why, so as a buyer of the blockchain-based token that representing the commodities, how do you and I know that there's actually commodities that back it up? Mm-hmm. So that's why
it takes a solution of trust.
Exactly. So that's why we need to have a layers of protections, starting with the legal protection in terms of contract and warehouse receipt law, starting with audit in terms of having auditors coming in and check out the stock in the warehouse. But ultimately, warehouse would have to put something at risk, like a performance bond. So if there's any issues, like when you and I go to the warehouse and trying to get our commodities out and the warehouse doesn't perform, then there's an amount of money that compensates us. So it is very, very important that the real world can be reflected on the blockchain, and that is one of the major hurdles that has prevented blockchain application in the real world. So what we see as hurdles is regulations. Hurdle in terms of the low awareness of the blockchain technology.
But is that going to be part of what you're doing here, creating more awareness?
Of course, that's why we had the meetup yesterday. Low awareness of the technology and sometimes even a very basic mix-up between cryptocurrency versus blockchain.
Yes, obviously. But obviously, you're optimistic that you will go beyond the pilot
So
stage.
the key thing is to keep the cost very low, so that it's a long journey.
Okay, Quan Le, thank you so much for your time today, and of course, all the best. We'll be keeping an eye on how it all develops from here. Thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.
That was Quan Le, CEO of Binkabi.